Lately, I've felt that there are a lot of great options out there for colorists who are looking to make hue adjustments and shape the luminance of their images, but when it comes to saturation, I've never actually been completely satisfied with the tools available. There's been a huge push these last few years towards subtractive saturation, with the recommendation often being to change your color model to HSV and play with the gain or gamma to add a more filmic saturation to your image. I think this is great and often a much welcome improvement to the default solutions offered by Resolve. But at the same time, there's also so much more that you can do with saturation beyond just setting your model to HSV that I've yet to see fully reflected in any of the tools out there. Because of this, over the last couple months, I've been developing a tool set for DaVinci Resolve solely focused on the goal of giving you more creative and intentional control over your saturation. So the tool set I've built comes in a couple different setups. There's a Hue V Sat, Sat V Sat, Lum V Sat, Basics only, and finally an all-in-one version. In each, you're given the standard controls of gain and gamma, where you can think of gain as your most basic global saturation knob and gamma as more of a vibrance or a color boost. In each, you're also given the option to smoothly fade the style of saturation used by the tool between additive and subtractive. Then, depending on the flavor of the tool you have open, you're also given a number of control points for shaping your versus curves. You can use these sliders to control exactly how you want your saturation to correlate to each channel, and smoothness is automatically maintained in your adjustments. To visualize what you're doing, you can also enable one of the given curve overlays. I've designed these sliders to be as intuitive as possible, and so in order to make sure their behavior remains consistent, it's important to also choose your current working space in the drop-down at the bottom of the tool so that it can automatically adapt to your setup. Now, in some cases, you may still find that you need even more control than just one versus curve can give you. So, for example, you could use the Lum V Sat curve to desaturate the highlights, but what about desaturating only the highlights that are already highly saturated, like traffic lights? This kind of operation would be more of a Lum V Sat, and to do this, I've also included mask sliders to focus your adjustments with even more control. So, using our example of desaturating high luminance high sat only, we could drop down our high sat slider, and then use the luminance mask to smoothly limit that adjustment to just the highlights. By default, these masks will limit the effect of the entire plugin, but in the all-in-one version, you also have the option to change the mask mode to apply to just a specific subsection of the tool. So now that you have a good overview of the tools, let's take a closer look at each module and go through some different examples. The first module, Hue V Sat, is probably the toolset you're most familiar with coming from Resolve's Color Slice or other existing DCTLs. You're given control over 6 vectors plus skin, but unlike Color Slice, priority has been placed on smoothness of the curve. So instead of the skin control limiting the range of the red and yellow controls around it, the skin control instead works on top of the other adjustments. And as you can see, when we move around our hue control points, a continuous spline is used to ensure these transitions between different hues remain as smooth as possible. What this means in practice is the adjustments feel more organic than surgical, and you can be more confident of your adjustments holding up at a global look level. And of course, you're also given control over each of these additional options, such as blending between additive and subtractive color models, and limiting your adjustments using the mask controls. Next up is Sat V Sat. This one gives you localized control between the low, mid, high, and extreme saturations of your image, which gives you more precise control than just balancing gain and gamma. This module is great for doing things like building looks that feel colorful without being overcooked, or bringing in super high saturated lights. For example, in this image I could try to go for a Wes Anderson inspired look by perhaps reducing our contrast a bit, and then adding a healthy amount of saturation targeting mostly the low and mid sats. Maybe a touch of gain in there as well to bring it up overall. So here's our before and our after. And just for fun, we could also try sort of the opposite. So if we reduce our low and mid sats and increase our high sat a bunch, then we can get a very different look. So as another example of the Sat V Sat, I have this shot here that came out super cooked in the sunset. So let's use the sat controls to deal with that. The extreme sat slider affects a range that normally won't appear in most images, but here you can see how in the center of the sunset, if I bring down the extreme sat, it's rolling back a bit of that craziness by giving the sat channel a smooth roll off. But then I can grab the high sat and really bring this down to a pleasing level. So before and after. And I can also play around with the additive versus subtractive to really dial in the lightness. And of course, if I needed to, I could also grab my Lum mask and limit this all to just the bright areas if I wanted to. Or we could even pump up that low saturation and go for a completely different look for the rest of the image if we wanted, without blasting that sunset even further. Alright, so now let's look at my personal favorite module, and one that is, in my opinion, super underrated and underused, especially in look development, which is Lum V Sat. In photochemical film, the more exposed an image is, the more desaturated it becomes, so the most visually saturated parts of the image tend to be in the shadows or the lower midtones. Working in a digital environment like we are, we can control this relationship ourselves using a Lum V Sat curve, so whether that's to emulate this characteristic of film or even go in the opposite direction. So let's try it out. If I push the shadow saturation and bring back the highlights, maybe add some to the midtones as well, we can get a really satisfying boost of color that, in my opinion, looks really, really good. This smooth desaturation as midtones transition into highlights, I've found also goes a long way in addressing that sort of chalky feeling that you can often see in a subject's skin with digital footage. Another thing that's helpful is if you enable the Lum V Sat curve overlay, this vertical line here is indicating your middle gray equivalent luminance. This isn't always very meaningful in the context of saturation, but I do find it to be a helpful reference for the curve. And more often than not, preserving saturation at this point will tend to preserve overall perceptual saturation of the image, though that's not always going to be the case. So continuing with this image, as always we can play with our additive versus subtractive slider to find that sweet spot for the density. And this sort of leads me to one of my favorite parts of this adjustment, which is if we lean into a subtractive saturation model here, then what we're getting is almost like a secret contrast adjustment. Because with a subtractive model, more sat in the shadows will decrease the perceived luminance, and likewise less sat in the highlights will increase perceived luminance. So the result is like an S-curve that affects only the color of your image without affecting the grayscale tone curve, which I think is super, super cool and a great way of adding filmic color separation to a look. So again, here's before and here's after. Now, of course, you can also go in the other direction. So here, this footage seems to naturally be a bit oversaturated in the shadows to my taste, as you can see in the shadow side of her face. So I can decrease the shadow sat, and that gives a bit of a cleaner look. Now, I could keep showing examples all day, but I also don't want to make this video too long, so one last thing I'd like to show is the black slider here. Now, most of the time you're not really going to see any difference moving this slider around, so I wanted to explain that the point of this slider is to control deep shadow noise. So imagine a shot is underexposed to begin with, and you have to bring it up. Sometimes you'll reveal some nasty colored noise in the shadows while doing this. So using this Isabella image as an example, if I bring it way up, you can see in the background here this ugly RGB noise. But if I use the black slider upstream of this, it gets cleaned up really nicely. So this slider can be a big help when dealing with underexposed and noisy footage. And as you can see in the curve, the transition into the upper shadows and midtones remains as smooth as possible. So no hard stops or unintentional tearing in your image. So thanks for watching, everyone. As you've seen, the bundle comes with 5 DCTLs, a basic, a Hue V Sat, Sat V Sat, Lum V Sat, and also an all-in-one version. And when you want a bit more specific control, you can also make use of the mask sliders included in each. If you're interested in trying it out, you can download a free demo from the link in the description, which is fully featured, lasts forever, just with a watermark. And as always, I'll be continuing to update the plugins whenever I can improve them, so if you have any suggestions or run into any odd behavior, or just have questions, feel free to send me a message. I'd love to chat and make the tool even better. Thanks all.